The unexpected trial, when justice calls for compassion. Chicago, a cold winter morning. Snow fell gently outside, but inside courtroom number 3, the tension was suffocating. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the fate of one woman. A single mother standing on the brink of a sentence she could not escape. Emily Parker, 28 years old, clenched her hands tightly as she sat before the icy gaze of Judge Jonathan Monroe, a man known as the machine of justice, someone who had never shown an ounce of mercy. He cared nothing for circumstances, never let emotions interfere with his rulings. The law was the law, and those who broke it had to pay the price. She knew that. She did not deny that she had run a red light at 2 a.m. But if anyone knew the real reason behind her actions, would they still be so quick to condemn her? Beside her, her little daughter, Sophie Parker, just 5 years old, sat quietly on the bench. Her round, innocent eyes held something far deeper than what a child should understand. Just the night before, that little girl had nearly lost her life to a sudden asthma attack. She had been gasping for air in the back seat of an old car, her lips pale as Emily desperately sped toward the hospital, ignoring a red light. One moment, one decision, and today, that mother stood in court, facing a sentence she could not defend with mere emotions. The prosecutor rose, his sharp voice cutting through the heavy silence. Defendant Emily Parker, do you admit to violating the city's traffic laws? Emily took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't run from this. But before she could open her mouth, a small yet powerful voice suddenly rang out. Please don't punish my mom. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes immediately turned to the 5-year-old girl. Sophie Parker, so small, yet her gaze held an unexpected strength. No one could have predicted that this little girl would be the one to change everything. Because at that moment, something no one expected happened. A long-buried secret began to unfold. What seemed like a simple trial suddenly became a battle between justice and compassion. Can the law truly judge what cannot be measured by numbers? Does a mother who risked everything to save her child deserve punishment? Would Judge Monroe, the rigid man of the law, dare to break the rules just this once? Or would justice, as always, turn its back on the weakest among us? The answer will shock you. This is not just a trial. This is a lesson about humanity, about sacrifice, about how a 5-year-old child can touch the heart of a man who seemed incapable of feeling. Are you ready for a story that will make you cry, make you reflect, and change the way you see life? Then don't miss this video. Subscribe to Golden Story now to experience more heartfelt and powerful stories like this. Because sometimes justice is not about punishment. It's about compassion. The unexpected trial. Chicago, a cold winter morning. Outside, delicate snowflakes fell gently, covering the streets in a thin, white layer. But inside courtroom number 3 of the city courthouse, the atmosphere was anything but gentle. The breaths of those present were visible in the crisp air of the vast chamber, where dim yellow lights reflected off dark wooden walls, making the space feel even more solemn and cold. At the center of the room, seated high on his authoritative bench, was Judge Jonathan Monroe, an immovable force as imposing as a stone statue. He was a legend in Chicago's judicial system, a man known for his unwavering adherence to the law, someone who interpreted every rule by the letter, never allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. Anyone who stood before him knew one thing for certain. Mercy was not an option. On the defendant's bench, Emily Parker, 28 years old, sat in silence, gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wore an old, slightly oversized coat, and her worn-out shoes still had traces of snow clinging to them. She didn't look like a criminal, more like someone who had been worn down by life. She knew she had broken the law. Running a red light at 2 a.m. was dangerous. She didn't deny that. But if they knew the reason behind it, would they still be so quick to judge? She glanced sideways at the small figure sitting beside her. Sophie Parker, just 5 years old, looked tiny on the long courtroom bench. She wore a pale blue sweater, clutching an old doll, one her mother had given her last year. Her large, round eyes showed no fear, only curiosity and a hint of innocence. While everyone else in the room bore solemn, tense expressions, Sophie simply looked around, occasionally furrowing her brows as if trying to make sense of what was happening. At the prosecution's table, the district attorney, a middle-aged man in a sharp black suit, was organizing his documents. He was the kind of man who cared only about the law, never letting emotions interfere with his work. When he glanced at Emily, there was no sympathy in his gaze, only determination. He rose to his feet, his voice crisp and precise, each word slicing through the heavy silence of the courtroom. Defendant Emily Parker, do you admit that on December 14th at 2 a.m., you ran a red light at the intersection of 5th and Lexington, thereby violating city traffic laws? Emily took a deep breath. She wanted to explain, wanted to say she had no other choice. But just as she opened her mouth, Judge Monroe raised a hand, signaling that she didn't need to justify herself. Yet, he flipped through her file, his sharp eyes scanning each line. Ms. Parker, his voice was deep and authoritative, this is your first offense. However, running a red light at night is an extremely dangerous act. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Emily swallowed hard. She knew her words might not be enough to sway this rigid judge, but she also knew she couldn't stay silent. Just as she was about to speak, a small but clear voice suddenly rang out in the quiet courtroom. Please don't punish my mom. The entire room froze. Every gaze immediately shifted towards Sophie Parker, the little girl who had just shattered the solemn atmosphere with a plea so pure, so unexpected. Emily's breath caught. The prosecutor blinked in surprise. A few people in the courtroom leaned forward, waiting to see what would happen next. On the judge's bench, for the first time during the hearing, Judge Monroe lifted his gaze from the file, his expression a mix of cold calculation and slight astonishment as he looked directly at the child. What did you just say? A strange silence filled the room. But after just a second, Sophie lifted her chin and repeated herself, her voice steady, fearless. Please don't punish my mom. She didn't do anything wrong. And in that moment, everything changed. A single mother and a race against time. Emily Parker couldn't remember the last time she had slept through the night. She worked 2 jobs just to keep up with expenses, spending her days at a laundromat, scrubbing through endless piles of dirty clothes with cracked, weary hands, and her nights at a fast food restaurant, where customers barely acknowledged her as anything more than a nameless part of the assembly line. Everything she did was for Sophie, her little girl, only 5 years old, but already used to long nights waiting for her mother to come home, to simple dinners, to a life that Emily wished she could shield her from. But there was one thing Emily had no control over: Sophie's asthma. The attacks came without warning, like a thief in the night, stealing her daughter's breath. The inhaler helped, but the medication was expensive, and Emily's wages were never enough. She had stood in a pharmacy before, staring at the price on the package, clutching the few crumpled bills in her wallet, torn between buying the medicine or paying rent. She hated making choices like that, but being a single mother didn't give her many options. The night, everything changed. It was a bitterly cold winter night. Outside, snow piled up, and the wind howled against the windows as if trying to force its way inside their small, aging apartment. Emily had just finished her night shift, her body aching from 8 hours of standing, her back sore, her hands still smelling of fryer grease. Sophie lay asleep in her small bed, wrapped in a thin blanket. But the moment Emily stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. Sophie's breathing was labored, uneven. Her tiny chest rose and fell too quickly, and when Emily gently shook her awake, the little girl's eyes opened in panic. She couldn't speak, couldn't get enough air. Another asthma attack. Emily frantically searched for the inhaler, but when she pressed the canister, only a weak hiss escaped. It was empty. Her heart dropped. Call an ambulance? Impossible. The city's emergency services at night often took 30 minutes or more. She didn't have that kind of time. Emily scooped Sophie into her arms, feeling her daughter's fragile body tremble against her. Without a second thought, she rushed out into the freezing night. She didn't care about the cold biting in her exposed skin, didn't care that she had no socks on. Her only thought was getting to the hospital. Her old car was parked outside, covered in a thin layer of snow. She placed Sophie in the back seat, wrapped her tightly in a blanket, then hit the gas, speeding into the icy darkness. The tires skidded slightly on the slick roads, the wind howling through the cracked window. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. Sophie was still awake, but her little face was tense, struggling for every breath. "I'm here, sweetheart. Hold on. We're almost there." She pressed harder on the gas. The moment of decision. The traffic light ahead glowed red. Emily instinctively hit the brakes, but when she glanced back at Sophie, her daughter gasping for air, her lips beginning to turn pale, she knew she couldn't afford to stop. She looked left, then right. The streets were empty. No cars. No people. Just a few seconds. Emily stepped on the gas, crossing the intersection, the tires cutting through the snowy pavement. She had no idea that a traffic camera had captured everything. She had no idea that this one moment would land her in a courtroom on a freezing winter morning. All she knew in that moment was that she had to save her daughter, no matter what it took. The intense trial. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The air was so thick with silence that it felt as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the defendant to speak her first words. Emily Parker sat motionless in the defendant's seat, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She felt as though the weight of the entire room was pressing down on her shoulders, as if all those piercing gazes were waiting for a verdict she knew she could not escape. On the prosecution's side, the district attorney, a middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored black suit, rose to his feet. Emily already knew what kind of man he was, the type who wouldn't yield an inch. To him, every violation, no matter how small, was a crime that must be punished. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice as sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, the law is the law. If we allow emotions to interfere, then the law loses its meaning. If we permit personal circumstances to justify violations, then the law ceases to function. That is simply unacceptable." He paused for a second before turning to Emily, his eyes cold and unwavering. The defendant, Emily Parker, ran a red light at 2 a.m. The traffic cameras captured the incident clearly. She may offer any excuse she wishes, but the undeniable fact remains. She broke the law. His words rang out, firm and irrefutable. A few people in the courtroom nodded in agreement. Others exchanged quiet glances. On the judge's bench, Judge Jonathan Monroe remained still, his gaze as sharp as a knife, meticulously scanning the room. He betrayed no emotion, merely flipping through the case file with the precision of someone reading a dry, impersonal report. He didn't look at Emily immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses slightly, his eyes moving across the printed words. Then, he folded the file shut, tapped his fingers lightly against the wooden desk, and finally lifted his gaze toward the defendant. "Ms. Parker." His voice was deep and commanding, filling the courtroom with a weight that made the silence even heavier. "Do you deny that you ran a red light?" All eyes turned to Emily. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew that if she lied, the court would see right through her. But if she simply admitted guilt without explanation, they would never understand the real reason behind her actions. "I refuse to be just another number in a traffic violation report." Emily tightened her grip, her shoulders trembling slightly under the pressure. But she lifted her chin, took a deep breath, and answered, "No, Your Honor." A pause. Then she swallowed, her voice unsteady but clear. "But I have a reason." A soft scoff escaped from the district attorney's lips, as if he had expected this response all along. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Many had heard excuses like this before. But Judge Monroe's expression remained unchanged. He tilted his head slightly, crossing his arms over his chest, his gaze locked onto Emily. "I hope it's a good one, Ms. Parker." His words carried no sympathy, yet there was no immediate rejection either. The entire courtroom fell into complete silence. Emily could feel her heartbeat pounding her chest, but she knew this was her only chance to make them understand. She took a deep breath, ready to tell them about that fateful night. A child's unexpected plea. Emily inhaled deeply, preparing to explain. But just as she opened her mouth, a small but clear voice cut through the heavy silence of the courtroom. "Please don't punish my mom. She didn't do anything wrong." The entire courtroom froze. Not a whisper, not a murmur. Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Standing beside her mother, Sophie Parker, only 5 years old, was looking up at Judge Monroe, her wide eyes filled with determination. She was small, but in that moment, she radiated an unusual courage, an awareness beyond her years, as if she understood that only she could change the course of what was happening. On the prosecution side, the district attorney stiffened, pressing his lips together. He had not anticipated this. The audience in the courtroom stirred slightly, some leaning forward, clearly drawn into the unexpected moment. But the biggest shift happened at the judge's bench. Judge Jonathan Monroe, the man known for his cold, unyielding demeanor, hesitated. His eyes, usually devoid of emotion, flickered just for a moment. Slowly, he set his pen down, as if the weight of this moment required his full attention. After a brief pause, he leaned slightly forward, his gaze settling on the little girl. "What did you just say?" His voice was no longer as cold as before. There was something different about it now. Curiosity, perhaps. Or something even deeper, something even he couldn't quite name. Sophie did not waver. She pointed directly at her mother, her tiny hands clutching the old doll she never went anywhere without. Her eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with unwavering belief in what she was about to say. "My mom isn't guilty. She was just trying to save me." The courtroom held its breath. No one dared to speak. No one dared to break the silence. Judge Monroe continued to stare at Sophie, his expression more complex than anyone had ever seen before. Because deep within his mind, a long-buried memory stirred. A memory he had tried to forget. The truth revealed. Sophie stood there, small but fearless, right in front of the judge's bench. The entire courtroom remained frozen in absolute silence, as if time itself had stopped. "My mom was only trying to save me." Her voice rang out, clear and unwavering, breaking the solemn air of the courtroom. There was no hesitation in Sophie's eyes, only sincerity and an unshakable belief in her mother. Judge Monroe did not take his eyes off the little girl. What he had just heard made him pause. But Sophie wasn't finished. "I'm sick. My mom works really hard to take care of me." A blink. A hard swallow. At the prosecution's table, the district attorney furrowed his brow slightly, his hands tightening into fists, as if he could sense that the case was beginning to slip from his grasp. Some in the audience lowered their heads, shifting in discomfort, while others softened their gaze toward the child. And then, the moment that changed everything happened. Sophie slowly rolled up the sleeve of her sweater, revealing a small bruise on her delicate arm, the mark left by an foreign needle from that fateful night. The courtroom felt as though it had been sucked of all air. Every eye was now locked onto the undeniable piece of evidence. Emily's mouth fell open, horror flashing across her face as she realized what Sophie had just done. She never wanted anyone to know. She had tried to hide the pain her daughter had endured. She had thought she could carry everything on her own. Her jobs, Sophie's illness, the bills, the worries, all of it. But right now, a 5-year-old child was standing in front of everyone, speaking the truth that Emily had kept buried for so long. A hot tear slid down Emily's cheek. She wanted to pull Sophie close, to tell her to stop, to say, "Mommy can handle this on her own." But Sophie simply lifted her chin, her eyes locked onto Judge Monroe as if he was the only person in the world who mattered at this moment. She didn't cry. She only told the truth. And in that moment, everything in the courtroom changed. An unexpected witness. The courtroom remained in stunned silence after Sophie revealed the bruise on her tiny arm. Everyone was in shock, especially Emily, who had done everything in her power to keep the harsh reality hidden. But just as the tension reached its peak, a calm, yet firm voice rose from the back of the room. "Your Honor, I would like to testify." All heads turned sharply. A middle-aged man stood up from the audience, his posture composed but his gaze sharp. He wore a long gray coat, his face lined with years of experience. Someone who had clearly seen life's harshest moments, yet carried an air of authority and reliability. Emily immediately recognized him. Dr. Raymond Carter, the very doctor who had treated Sophie that night. He walked forward slowly, his expression unwavering as he stopped near the witness stand. The district attorney stiffened, clearly displeased with this unexpected development in a case he thought was firmly under his control. Judge Monroe's brows knit together slightly, but he remained silent, only giving a slight nod, signaling for Dr. Carter to proceed. The doctor adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, then looked directly at the judge with a serious expression. "Your Honor, my name is Dr. Raymond Carter. I was the attending physician on the night of the incident, and I can confirm everything this little girl has said is true." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people leaned toward each other in hushed whispers. This case now had a direct witness. The district attorney clenched his jaw, clearly feeling the momentum shift against him. Judge Monroe tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze narrowing, but he did not interrupt. Dr. Carter continued, his voice firm and unwavering. That night, Sophie Parker arrived at the hospital in critical condition. If she hadn't received immediate medical attention, the consequences could have been severe, potentially even life-threatening. A wave of shock swept through the courtroom. A few people in the audience gasped. Others clenched their fists, visibly trying to contain their emotions. Dr. Carter turned toward Emily, his gaze softening slightly. Her mother brought her to the hospital under circumstances that any parent would understand. It wasn't a choice. It was survival. She couldn't wait for an ambulance. She had to act immediately. Emily trembled. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, but not out of despair. This time, they fell because someone was finally speaking the truth she had been unable to say herself. The district attorney opened his mouth, preparing to object, but he couldn't. He couldn't argue against a medical professional. He couldn't argue against a truth this undeniable. Judge Monroe's fingers tapped lightly against his desk. Those who had worked with him long enough recognized the gesture. He was thinking deeply. A shift was happening. And for the first time since the trial began, no one could predict what would happen next. The video that proved innocence. The emotional storm in the courtroom had yet to settle when an unexpected voice broke through the tension. "Your Honor, I have crucial evidence to present." All eyes turned toward the defense table, where a sharp yet composed man rose to his feet, holding a stack of documents firmly in his hands. Lucas Bennett, the court-appointed attorney for Emily, had remained relatively quiet until now. But in this moment, he stepped forward with absolute confidence, locking eyes with Judge Monroe. "I would like to present footage from the traffic camera at the time of the incident." Immediately, a large screen was turned on beside the judge's bench. A court officer connected the system, and within seconds, the black and white surveillance footage flickered to life. The room fell completely silent. Every gaze fixated on the screen, where a silver sedan sped toward the intersection in the dead of night. It was Emily's car. Judge Monroe sat up straighter, his fingers interlaced, his sharp gaze dissecting every frame as if trying to see beyond the surface. Attorney Bennett raised a hand and pointed at the screen. "Your Honor, please pay close attention." The footage slowed, displaying the timestamp, 2:03 a.m. Emily's car approached the intersection. Then, it stopped. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. On the video, it was clear. The car had come to a halt for several seconds, as if Emily had hesitated, checking the road before making her decision. Then, instead of recklessly speeding through, she carefully accelerated, crossing the intersection with measured caution before continuing into the night. Bennett nodded before turning back to Judge Monroe. "What does this footage show, Your Honor?" That the defendant was not reckless. She did not ignore the law. She stopped. She assessed the situation before making her decision. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Some leaned forward, others nodded in agreement. The law could be rigid, but the footage did not lie. Judge Monroe remained expressionless, but something in his eyes had changed. A simple truth had just been revealed. Emily Parker was not a criminal. She was simply a mother trying to do the right thing in a world that did not always give her many choices. The shift in Judge Monroe. The courtroom remained silent, but the air had shifted. Judge Jonathan Monroe, known for his unyielding stance, for upholding the law as an absolute truth, was no longer so sure. He looked at Sophie, the small but unshaken child, her bright eyes burning with pure belief that the truth would prevail. Then he looked at Emily, the struggling single mother who had done everything in her power to keep her daughter safe. And suddenly, an image surfaced in his mind. A different child, a different pair of eyes. The past, a scar that had never faded. A memory from the past. Monroe thought of his son, Daniel. Daniel had once been full of life, intelligent, and endlessly curious, just like Sophie, standing before him now. But as the years passed, a distance grew between them. Why? Because he had never truly understood his son. He had always taught Daniel that life was built on unbreakable rules, that only the law could keep order in the world. He had never allowed for weakness, never allowed for exceptions. And because of that, Daniel had walked away. The day his son left Chicago, he had looked at Monroe with disappointment in his eyes. You only care about rules, Dad. But have you ever asked yourself if those rules are truly fair? Those were the last words his son ever said to him before the door slammed shut. And after that, Daniel never came back. The present, a moment of decision. Now, years later, Judge Monroe looked at Sophie and suddenly realized this could be another Daniel, a child who just wanted to be heard, a child fighting to protect the person she loved most. And this time, what would he do? Would he cling to the rigid laws he had followed his entire life? Or would he listen, not just with his mind, but with his heart, something he had never done for his own son? His fingers tightened slightly. He could feel something shifting within him. And for the first time in years, he was no longer sure if he was still the same Judge Monroe he had always been. The verdict no one expected. Judge Monroe took a deep breath, then closed the case file, his hands resting firmly on the polished wooden bench. He looked up, first at Emily Parker, then at Sophie, who still stood there, her bright eyes filled with unwavering belief. And when he spoke for the first time since the trial began, his voice was no longer cold. Emily Parker, I have decided to dismiss all charges against you. The courtroom erupted. A wave of murmurs and gasps spread through the room. Whispers, stunned expressions, and looks of disbelief. Emily's eyes widened, as if she couldn't trust what she had just heard. What did you say? She stammered, her voice trembling as if she needed to hear it again to believe it was real. Judge Monroe's gaze remained firm. I said this case is dismissed. You will not have to pay any fines. At the prosecution's table, the district attorney immediately shot to his feet, his face flushed with both shock and protest. Your Honor, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow personal circumstances to excuse traffic violations, the law will lose its meaning. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to see how Judge Monroe would respond. But he simply raised a hand, a firm yet authoritative gesture that silenced the room. No one dared to argue. The prosecutor pressed his lips together, but ultimately sat down, gripping his case files tightly, clearly unsatisfied. But Monroe wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze settling on Emily, not with the icy detachment from before, but with something warmer, something deeper. And I'm going to do something else. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room once more. Emily tensed. Sophie looked up, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. No one knew what was coming next. Judge Monroe held Emily's gaze as he delivered a decision that no one in that courtroom could have predicted. An unexpected gift. The courtroom was still buzzing with hushed voices when a court clerk walked briskly toward the judge's bench, holding a cream-colored folder. All eyes followed every movement, uncertainty hanging in the air. The clerk carefully placed the folder before Judge Monroe, then stepped back. Monroe removed his glasses, setting them down neatly, before turning his full attention to Emily Parker. Mrs. Parker, he said, his voice no longer carrying the usual strictness, but instead a measured calmness and understanding. This case is about more than just a traffic violation. It is about a mother, a child, and a system that has failed to support them. He pushed the folder forward and nodded at the court clerk. The clerk carefully picked up the document and carried it over to Emily, handing it to her. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope, confusion written all over her face. She had no idea what this was until she read the words printed inside. Her eyes widened. The letter's contents. Emily Parker. The Chicago Single Parent Assistance Fund has approved a special grant to help you stabilize financially, ensuring you no longer need to work multiple jobs. St. Mary's Hospital has agreed to fully cover all medical expenses and treatments for Sophie Parker until she turns 18. Emily's breath hitched. Her hands shook harder, clutching the paper to her chest as if letting go would make it vanish like a fleeting dream. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice breaking. She looked up at Judge Monroe, her eyes shimmering with tears. Why? Monroe held her gaze, and for the first time, there was no sharpness, no detachment. Because sometimes justice is not about punishment. Sometimes it is about protecting those who need it most. Emily could no longer hold back. Hot tears streamed down her face. Tears not of sorrow, but of relief, of gratitude, of a weight finally being lifted from her shoulders. She pressed the letter against her chest, knowing that this was more than just words on a page. This was a second chance, a lifeline, a way forward. Sophie tugged at her mother's sleeve, her little voice filled with excitement. "Mommy, does this mean you don't have to work late anymore?" Emily knelt down, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace, her tears soaking into Sophie's soft hair. "No, sweetheart. Mommy will have more time with you now." A round of applause broke out in the courtroom. First from a few, then spreading until the entire audience was on their feet, clapping in recognition of what had just happened. Even the court clerk couldn't hide a smile, and in the back, a few people discreetly wiped away their own tears. The prosecutor had nothing left to say. He simply nodded, knowing. Even he couldn't argue against the rightness of this decision. Judge Monroe sat quietly in his seat, watching everything unfold. And inside him, something shifted, a feeling he had refused to acknowledge for years. Perhaps his son had been right. The law was not just about punishment. Sometimes it was about fixing what was unjust. The judge's transformation. A year had passed. Chicago remained the same, bustling, fast-paced, its towering skyscrapers standing tall beneath the fiery glow of the setting sun. But something had changed, something only those who paid close attention would notice. In the corner of a grand city hall auditorium, Judge Jonathan Monroe stood silently, hands clasped behind his back, watching the ceremony unfold before him. Today was not a trial. Today was an award ceremony, one honoring students who had overcome adversity with resilience and excellence. He did not usually attend events like this, but today he chose to be here because he knew there was one name on the recipient list that meant something special. The host stepped onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and spoke in a formal yet warm tone. And this year's honorary award for extraordinary perseverance goes to a young girl who has not only overcome life's challenges, but has also inspired those around her. Please welcome to the stage, Sophie Parker. The room erupted into applause. From the front row, a 6-year-old girl stood up, wearing a simple light blue dress. Yet her face shone brighter than any spotlight. Sophie glanced at her mother, Emily, who was clapping, tears glistening in her eyes. Taking a deep breath, the little girl stepped onto the stage, her small steps steady, her confidence unwavering. As she accepted the honorary certificate, Sophie did not immediately turn to leave. She stood there for a moment, scanning the crowd as if looking for someone. And then she found him. Judge Monroe, standing in the back of the room, saying nothing, making no gesture, but his gaze had softened. There was something in his eyes, something even he had never quite recognized before. Sophie smiled, a pure, innocent smile, but one filled with meaning. Monroe gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, one of acknowledgement, of silent understanding. No one else in the auditorium noticed that fleeting moment. But for Sophie and for Monroe, it meant more than words ever could. Because today was not just an award ceremony. It was proof that change had happened. Not just in Sophie Parker's life, but in the heart of Judge Jonathan Monroe. A perfect ending. Morning in Chicago felt more peaceful than ever. Golden sunlight streamed through a small window, casting a warm glow over the old wooden table. The comforting scent of freshly made pancakes filled the cozy kitchen, blending with the soft aroma of coffee. Emily Parker sat at the table, flipping through the pages of a book with a kind of ease she had never known before. Across from her, 6-year-old Sophie swung her little legs under the chair, happily devouring her pancake, drowning it in syrup with every bite. Mid-bite, Sophie suddenly paused, her round eyes filled with thought. "Mom." Emily lowered her book, smiling at her daughter. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sophie propped her chin on her hands, tilting her head in curiosity. "Do you think Judge Monroe likes pancakes?" Emily let out a surprised laugh, a soft, nostalgic laugh, full of memories. She set her book down, glancing out the window, looking at the streets she once rushed through, the struggles she once carried. Everything had changed. She took a deep breath, her gaze distant but warm. "I think he does now." Sophie giggled, adding another layer of syrup to her pancake, as if preparing a special treat for someone. And in that small, simple moment, nothing more needed to be said. Because this story was never just about a trial, never just about a dismissed fine. It was about understanding, about second chances, about how one small act could change the course of a life. And sometimes, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about compassion. It's about kindness. It's about the little moments, like a plate of pancakes on a quiet morning.